Hare Krishna, and welcome to our virtual Sunday feast, brought to you today from Sage Cottage, County Wicklow, Republic of Ireland. I'm Korma Das. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So today, we're going to continue on with our big reading from the great Transcendental adventure, Pastimes of His Divine Grace, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, Srila Prabhupada in Australia and New Zealand. We're reading the book cover to cover, a wonderful book about the early days of Krishna consciousness in that great big land down under. And today is episode number 4. So last time, when we read from the book, we finished up just a few pages actually from the end of chapter 1. And chapter 1 is entitled This Novel Idea. All sorts of amazing things have taken place and devotees have appeared out of apparently nowhere to take part in the Sankirtan movement. Jan, the budding actress, came and went to America to increase her acting career, and then she moved into the Los Angeles temple and she never moved out. And devotees are just doing all sorts of miraculous things. And we'll hear more about this right now, beginning with Stan, yet another devotee who was, should we say, discovered way back 51 years ago by Krishna. So here we go. Stan, a 28-year-old ex-petty officer from the Royal Australian Navy, worked as a technical officer for the Defence Department. One evening, as he returned home from his downtown government job, he stopped off at the corner store to pick up a newspaper and the weekly TV guide. Sitting in his modest Emu Plains home in outer Sydney, he flicked through TV Week until an article caught his eye. Weird sect rules star's life. The article showed a bright-faced young lady holding a Krishna book. The caption read, "Jan has renounced all material possessions and is to marry a Japanese monk she has never met." Interesting stuff, thought Stan, and he read on. Quote, from the TV Week, a very interesting publication. Jan has no doubts, concerns, or fears about marrying a man she has never met, written to, or spoken to. Quote, "If Krishna feels it is all right, then I feel it is all right," she said. The saris of the Krishna women are fashioned in 2 colors. The one Jan wore in the sparse room of the Los Angeles temple was pink. It signified that the Australian television actress turned devotee of Krishna, the one supreme God, was unmarried. Soon, however, she would wear the marital robes of yellow. Of course, for those of you who are following the story, Jan is just about to become Jagatarini Devi Dasi, and who is now the wife of Burijana Prabhu. So all these stories are interlinked. She went to Los Angeles. Australian TV Week went all the way to Los Angeles to interview her. "I'm going to Tokyo in about 2 weeks to get married," she said suddenly. "This is my whole life now. I will never go back. I am totally committed to Krishna." When Jan Wesley forsook her old life 3 months ago to join the Hare Krishna movement, its men with shaved heads, robes, and chanting, as familiar in Bondi as it is on Hollywood Boulevard, she gave up everything material to do it. Continues the article. "Everything we have was given to us in the first place by Krishna," she said. Today, Krishna is her preoccupation, 24 hours a day, and her needs, she finds, are minimal. A little clothing, shelter, a vegetarian diet, a notebook, and her Krishna books will go everywhere with her, along with a photograph of the movement's spiritual leader, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. "It is a sparse life of work and devotion," continued TV Week. She likens it to a nun's life, and her reaction is one of amazement when asked if she is free to leave the temple. "Why would I want to leave?" she said. "Everything I want is here." The key to her sudden conversion was a meeting with the movement's founder in Los Angeles, and she senses a significance in the myriad little things that routed her trip through Los Angeles rather than directly to London. If it hadn't been for a pen that the Sydney temple devotees had asked me to deliver, she would never have gone, she said. I had no interest, she recalled. But when I arrived and I met Prabhupada, that was the turning point. It was the thing that was missing back in Australia. The article concluded, however others judged the Hare Krishna movement, whatever their suspicions and however immature they may regard her conversion, Jan Wesley is unmoved. Krishna, she said, leaning forward intently, fulfills all desires. End of article. Stan was impressed. Well, here's someone who knows where they're going in life, she thought. The next day, Stan rang the Sydney temple, and after speaking to Tirthapada, invited the devotees to a multicultural festival he was organizing in the Blue Mountains. The devotees came. They set up a book display. They chanted, handed out prasadam. Once again, Stan was impressed. Here's something really attractive, he thought, and soon he and his wife, Joy, and their 2 young children became regular attendees at the Paddington Centre. One day, Chris, yet to become Charudas, and Chris is actually pretty much running the temple at this point because the 2 original devotees, Balimadana and Upendra, have been sent elsewhere by Srila Prabhupada. One day, Chris was shocked to find Tirthapada packing his bags, ready to leave the temple. Despite his best attempts, Chris could not convince Tirthapada to stay. What's the problem? Tirthapada explained how he had stopped chanting, and troubled by sex desire, he decided to live outside the temple, but he still planned to attend temple functions. Tirthapada left, promising to attend the temple regularly. He visited just once. "You forget," he said. Chris remembered Upendra's stories from the early days. Maya is very strong, Upendra had explained that Srila Prabhupada had told him. Some men will fall. Those who sincerely follow his instructions to chant Hare Krishna and avoid sinful activities would be successful. Prabhupada had compared the Hare Krishna mantra to a big cannon. Go and sound this cannon so that everyone can hear it, he said, and it will drive away Maya. Now, Chris was practically the senior man in the temple. Balimadana had promised to return as soon as possible to oversee Sydney's progress. He had recommended Chris for initiation. He would receive his new name and chanting beads in the mail very soon. And Srila Prabhupada had promised to come to Australia in January. Chris knew little of Krishna consciousness, and the others knew even less. Yet their firm faith in Srila Prabhupada compensated for their lack of experience. They accepted Prabhupada as a pure devotee, directly in touch with God. They accepted his books as truth. They accepted Krishna as a supreme personality of Godhead. They hardly knew how to cook, lecture, or worship the deities, but they knew Prabhupada wanted them to chant Hare Krishna publicly and distribute Back to Godhead magazines on the streets of Sydney. Despite frequent arrests, they did it regularly. Chris recalled a recent letter from Srila Prabhupada. Krishna consciousness, Prabhupada had written, was flourishing all over the world by the grace of Lord Chaitanya. Now it was the responsibility of his disciples to work hard to maintain these programs. Quote, "Now it is up to you to keep on working vigorously in the service of the Lord, and because he is seated within your heart, He will reveal from within all necessary intelligence for you to further extend your loving, devotional service to him. End of quote. The Australian devotees lacked training, but they were sincere. The stage was now set for Srila Prabhupada to personally enter. In the meantime, they would continue their business to administer this novel idea of Krishna consciousness to the people of Sydney. End of chapter 1. So today we're going to start chapter 2, and here we go. Chapter 2 is entitled In the Hands of the Malechas. Sydney, 1971. 50 years ago. Half a century. Here's a keynote quote from the beginning of the chapter. Quote, "Now I am leaving you in the hands of the Malechas. I cannot take the responsibility. You, please guide these boys and girls and give them the intelligence to worship you nicely." End of quote. This is written by Srila Prabhupada, or should I say this was spoken by Srila Prabhupada on 14th of May, 1971. After 6 months in India, plans were being made for Srila Prabhupada to visit his disciples worldwide. He had written, quote, "I'm concerned about my disciples. I want to see them quite able to preach this sublime doctrine of Krishna consciousness. As a sannyasin, I should not fix up at a certain place to take your service comfortably. It is not the desire of Krishna. He wants me traveling throughout the whole western part of the world." Unquote. Consequently, in early January 1971, Chris, now initiated as Charu, received a letter from Srila Prabhupada's secretary, Karandar. Charu recalls. The letter said that Prabhupada was going to be visiting Moscow, amongst other places, and that every temple president should write a letter inviting Srila Prabhupada to visit them. I was unaware that Srila Prabhupada had already intimated to Bali Madan and Upendra that he may come to Australia, so I never really thought that Srila Prabhupada would visit us. I thought that it was just a point of etiquette that the disciple asked the spiritual master to visit, but the spiritual master, of course, politely declines. At that time, I was still a brand new devotee. I didn't know anything, and I was thinking of Srila Prabhupada in kind of material terms. I was thinking that a 72-year-old man wouldn't want to travel all the way to Australia. I couldn't know that Srila Prabhupada was destined to circle the world 12 times in as many years. All the stories that Upendra used to regale us with about Srila Prabhupada were of Srila Prabhupada in San Francisco, and I had a picture of him as being more or less stationary. End of recollection by Charu. Besides that, Charu wondered how they could afford to pay for 3 airline tickets, one for Srila Prabhupada and one each for his servant and secretary. Temple finances were tight. Even on a good day, the devotees could sell at the utmost 100 Back to Godhead magazines on the street. And we used to sell them for 20 cents each, mind you. With a $55 a week rent, that's sharp, isn't it? $55 per week rent on the shopfront temple, as well as so many other expenses, it seemed impossible. Despite these obstacles, in late February 1971, Charu wrote to Srila Prabhupada formally inviting him to visit Sydney. On their return journey to Sweden via India in early 1971, Jürgen and his girlfriend Marion, remember them? They were coming around the Sydney temple with their friend Willie, and Willie did not go to India with them. Willie decided to stay and become a devotee in Sydney. But his friends, Jürgen and Marion, they found themselves in Bombay. They were determined to visit the devotees before leaving India, but try as they might, they could not locate the Bombay address. After a week of fruitless searching, Marian and Jürgen were ready to give up. On the day before they planned to leave India, however, one young Indian man had directed Jürgen and Marian to the impressive Akasha Ganga apartment building on Marine Drive, one of Bombay's most vital and prestigious locations. Surely they're not in there, thought Jürgen. But after climbing the stairs to the 7th floor as directed, they found the plaque, ISKCON, on the wall, and they indeed met the devotees. Prabhupada's young disciples greeted them warmly, excitedly telling him that Prabhupada would be arriving in Bombay in only a few weeks' time, and he would be staying with them. Jürgen and Marian couldn't believe their good fortune. They soon found themselves swept up in the devotees' contagious enthusiasm to prepare the temple for Prabhupada's visit. It wasn't long before the young couple had cancelled their plans to return to Europe and had moved into the temple as full-time devotees. While helping to build an altar and renovate Srila Prabhupada's quarters, they learned of a huge Hare Krishna festival planned for Bombay, a grand 11-day Pandal program to be held at the Cross Maidan exhibition grounds in South Bombay. The massive festival, Prabhupada had said, would be a perfect way to link American ingenuity with Indian spirituality. Jürgen started going out daily, assisting Giriraj and Shyamasundar in collecting funds from life members, while Marian assisted Yamuna and Malati in sewing and cooking. After preaching in Surat, Calcutta, Allahabad and Gorakhpur, Srila Prabhupada arrived at the ISKCON Bombay headquarters on the 24th of February 1971. Shyamasundara had arranged for an enormous publicity campaign with giant posters and banners strung across the streets, helium-filled balloons and advertisements in every newspaper. Subsequently, the festival started on the 25th of March with 10,000 people attending during the first day and 20,000 that night. The large stage easily accommodated both the devotees dancing in kirtan each evening and the white marble deities of Radha and Krishna, who were enthroned within a gorgeous golden domed altar surrounded by abundant floral arrangements. The tall and spacious pandal tent, built to hold more than 30,000 people, was lined with fluorescent bulbs, and kirtan, prasadam, lectures and slideshows were main features. Bombay's most important citizens came with their well-groomed wives to join in the chanting. Some of them were intent on listening to the lectures and inquiring deeply into devotional life, while others came simply to see the deities, take prasadam, or appreciate the kirtan. Towards the end of the festival, Srila Prabhupada decided to initiate and marry Jürgen and Marian before thousands of people on stage at the Pandal. On the chosen night, the sacrificial arena was set up on stage to the left of the deity's altar. The audience were already amazed to see foreign devotees, but now on top of that, they were doubly impressed. Here was a young Western boy and girl taking initiation vows and being married in front of 10,000 people. She with her opulent red sari, and he with his fresh white silk dhoti, shaven head and kurta. When Jürgen and Marian came up to receive their beads, Srila Prabhupada asked them, "So where would you like to go?" Jürgen was submissive. "Wherever you would like us to go, Srila Prabhupada. So you should go back to Australia and help them," Prabhupada replied, and it was settled. Srila Prabhupada gave Jürgen the new name Bhagavan Das, and Marian became Padmavati Devi Dasi. They're living in Sweden to this very day. By the time the glamorous wedding ceremony had begun, the audience was enthralled. During the ceremony, as Prabhupada pronounced Bhagavan and Padmavati, husband and wife, he mentioned that she was from Australia and he was from Sweden. As Srila Prabhupada proclaimed, this is the real United Nations. And the entire audience burst into a prolonged, spontaneous applause. One day in Bombay, Srila Prabhupada received Charu's letter of invitation. Charu reported how Sankirtan was enthusiastically progressing on a daily basis in Sydney, and that as a result of this, many new devotees had joined. The accompanying photograph showed them at the front door and on the balcony of the temple chanting with arms upraised. It appeared as if the whole shop front was bursting with devotees, and Srila Prabhupada was very pleased. Prabhupada at once made definite plans to visit Australia, and he drafted a return letter. He and 2 assistants would soon visit Sydney, and the money for 3 tickets should now be sent. It had come to Srila Prabhupada's attention that 2 of his disciples, Aravinda and Devananda, were both vying to continue as his personal servant when he travelled from Bombay. But since only one man was required for the post, it had become a contentious issue. Prabhupada gave the matter careful consideration. He decided that since Bhagavan was going back to Australia anyway, he should accompany Srila Prabhupada, and without delay, he trained as Prabhupada's new servant. Padmavati would join him later. Devananda immediately showed Bhagavan the ropes. The servant would have to see that Prabhupada had fresh, clean clothes daily, arrange for the preparation and serving of Prabhupada's prasadam twice a day, organize Prabhupada's regular massage, look after packing and unpacking his belongings, mix his medicines in his mortar and pestle, to name but a few of his duties. Prabhupada had also decided that since there were no deities in Sydney, the smaller of the 2 white marble Radha and Krishna deities that had presided over Cross Maidan and who were now receiving regular worship at ISKCON Bombay, be brought to Australia for installation in the Sydney temple by Prabhupada, and Bhagavan would assist in bringing them with him. Charu was shocked when he received the small blue airmail letter from Bombay containing Srila Prabhupada's acceptance of his invitation to visit Sydney. He excitedly broke the news to all the devotees. Now, I had moved in the temple at this point. I was a young, shaved-headed Kurma, yet to be Kurma, and I was there when he made the announcement, and we were all jumping up and down and squealing and all sorts of things. So I wasn't squealing, the girls were squealing. So he excitedly broke the news to all of us. Although thrilled and honoured that Prabhupada would soon be visiting them, Charu still wondered how he would be able to raise the money for 3 airline tickets. Prabhupada's letter was posted on the temple with the hope that it would inspire someone to donate some funds for the travel expenses. I remember the letter. It was like one of those thermometer type letters where there was the full amount and you'd colour in the bit underneath as it crept higher and higher. Well, it wasn't creeping higher at all because we had to find $3,000. Where were we going to find $3,000? We could hardly pay the rent. Stan was becoming increasingly involved in Krishna consciousness. Sometimes he would drive to the temple for the early morning program. It was a long way from where he lived. And go to his office job in the city from there. Then again, after work at 5 p.m., he would meet up with the devotees downtown, chant with them, dressed in his business suit and tie. Stan especially relished returning to the temple for the evening arati and kirtan. If you're there watching this, Raghunath, this is your story. Stan became Raghunath, but I'm jumping ahead a bit. And he enjoyed reading back to Godhead, especially those articles that discussed themes from the Bhagavad Gita. He had read other editions of Bhagavad Gita, but they hadn't made any sense. Now, however, his understanding of the Bhagavad Gita was increasing. He would regularly bring his family to the Sunday feasts. One day, Charu approached Stan with a request. Since Stan was the only devotee with a regular job, perhaps he could help out with the funding of Prabhupada's and his assistants' fares to Sydney. Stan discussed it with his wife, Joy. They had just sold their house and could afford to make a contribution, they reasoned. Stan and Joy decided to pay for all the airfares of Prabhupada and his entourage, and soon after, he gave an extra $3,000. Plans were made for Srila Prabhupada to visit Sydney sometime in May. Only the dates needed finalizing. To see how all of these, everything is interconnected here. It's quite astonishing. On the 3rd of May, Bhagavan, still marvelling at his good fortune, found himself at Bombay Airport ready to accompany Srila Prabhupada on his long trip to Sydney via Malaysia. The Radha Krishna deities had been tightly wrapped in cloth. Krishna had been placed in a crate and was loaded into the luggage hold. Bhagavan, carefully carrying Srimati Radharani under one arm and Prabhupada's small white attaché case in the other, checked in and proceeded to immigration. But there he encountered last-minute problems. What were those last-minute problems, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. He had overstayed his visa for India. Oops. And the officials were adamant he could not board the aircraft. Bhagavan frantically explained his plight to Srila Prabhupada, who calmly walked over to the immigration men and spoke a few words to them in Hindi. After a few minutes, they let Bhagavan through. Most likely they went like this. It is all right. Everything is all right, sir. This was to be an extensive world tour. Although Srila Prabhupada's itinerary was indefinite, his general plan was to travel widely for a few months, starting in Malaysia, through Sydney, back to Calcutta, and then on to Moscow, Paris, Los Angeles, San Francisco for the Rath Yatra Festival, then back to Los Angeles, Detroit, New York, London, and finally to Bombay. Whew, what an itinerary. As far as Moscow was concerned, he was still awaiting a letter of permission from the Soviet government, which he indeed received. Another miraculous story. Previously, Srila Prabhupada had toured extensively in America and India. However, apart from the few weeks in Hamburg and Tokyo and a few months in England, this was Prabhupada's first main tour of the world. Srila Prabhupada was traveling as a mendicant missionary, like Narada Muni. And just as Narada Muni travels throughout the universe, spreading transcendental sound, Srila Prabhupada was now similarly journeying to all parts of the world. As a news journalist in India had appropriately called him recently, he was a jet-age Parivrajacharya. Whereas this was to be Srila Prabhupada's first visit to Australia, it was the second visit for Radha and Krishna. How is that, you ask? Perhaps only a handful of people at the time knew the circumstances behind this amazing fact. And I'm going to share that amazing fact with you now. Listen up. Many months before, while the Sydney devotees were still residing in the beachside suburb of Bondi, the temple was visited by an Indian gentleman named Mr. Singh. That's not a common name, is it? I tried to find Mr. Singh, but since there's whole telephone books of Mr. Singh's, I was unable to find him for him to tell me more about the story. He was happy to see Krishna consciousness established in Australia and promised to send some Radha and Krishna deities to the Sydney temple when he returned to India. The devotees thanked him, but they didn't take his offer very seriously, and soon the whole incident was forgotten. Mr. Singh, however, had meant what he had said. On returning to India, Mr. Singh purchased a small set of Radha and Krishna deities, packed them in a crate, and sent them by boat to the Bombay temple address. But by the time the crate had arrived, the Sydney temple had relocated to Paddington. The devotees had left no forwarding address, and so the unclaimed crate was put into bond storage and finally shipped back to the sender's address in Bombay. That's That's astonishing enough, but there's more to the astonishing story. Mr. Singh was understandably disappointed. He had donated to Radha and Krishna, sent them to the Sydney Temple, and the Sydney Temple had sent them back. Of course, the Sydney Temple hadn't sent them back because the Sydney Temple never received them because they'd moved. So they were put into bond and sent back, and he received them. So what to do? Well, still wanting to donate the deities to ISKCON, he went to the Bombay Temple and he offered them to Srila Prabhupada, who subsequently installed them to temporarily preside over the Cross Maidan Pandal and receive regular worship in the Akash Ganga apartment temple. Now, by their own sweet will, Radha and Krishna were returning again to Australia, this time under the careful and loving auspices of their intimate servant, Srila Prabhupada. That's a mind-blowing story. At around lunchtime, Srila Prabhupada and Bhagavan crossed the tarmac and boarded the plane. Remember when we used to cross the tarmac? Doesn't happen anymore. Not very often. Bhagavan recalls, I was sitting beside Srila Prabhupada on the plane, and after a short time in the air, Srila Prabhupada requested that I serve him prasadam. My wife Padmavati had been learning how to cook from her senior godsisters in Bombay, and today had prepared the lunch which she had packed into a tiffin for the flight. Prabhupada appeared to enjoy his standard fare of dal, rice, vegetables, chapatis and sweets. And as he ate off bell-metal utensils, he especially appreciated Padmavati's chapatis. Prabhupada insisted that I also take lunch. It was very intimate. At one stage, I told Srila Prabhupada that Australia had no culture, and Prabhupada replied, they have no culture, so we'll give them Krishna consciousness. Their culture, he said, is only nightclubs, drinking, and dancing with naked girls. And that really was a good description of Australian culture, I'd say. Nearly 1 million Indians lived in Malaysia, many of them wealthy and influential, and the devotees had met with some success there. A few of Srila Prabhupada's newly initiated disciples had been preaching in Malaysia for several months and had arranged various speaking programs for Prabhupada's 5 or 6 day stop on the peninsula. On first arriving at Kuala Lumpur, Srila Prabhupada had met with Balimadana, who had been overseeing the activities in Malaysia in his capacity as the GBC representative for Southeast Asia. While en route to Malaysia earlier in the year, Balimadana had briefly revisited the Sydney Temple. He had been happy to discover that their enthusiastic preaching had attracted many new devotees. Now, after travelling with Srila Prabhupada in Malaysia, Balimadana was returning to Australia as Srila Prabhupada's secretary. After 2 days in Kuala Lumpur, where Prabhupada's party stayed in the home of a wealthy Sindhi merchant, Srila Prabhupada was driven to Telok Anson, where he also spoke at a pre-arranged program. After speaking at Ipoh and other programs in Penang, Srila Prabhupada flew back to Kuala Lumpur and arrived late in the afternoon of Friday, the 7th of May. Prabhupada's pastimes in Malaysia constitute a whole separate book, by the way. Kuala Lumpur, Saturday, the 8th of May, 1971. The devotees were amazed to discover that Srila Prabhupada had no visa to visit Australia. Amoga recalls, all that needed to be done was that the Indian embassy had to give some stamp of permission, and the Australian consulate had to issue a visa. Prabhupada was due to fly out that night. Talk about 11th hour. But it was Saturday morning, and all the embassies were closed. It was very hectic. Finally, Gopal Das went to the homes of the right persons and convinced them to give permission for Prabhupada to travel. I carried Srila Prabhupada's passport in my hands as we finalized pre-boarding formalities at Kuala Lumpur airport. I noted something very nice written in the front of his passport, where it said father's name. Srila Prabhupada had written, the late Sri Srimad Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj, his spiritual master. Srila Prabhupada, Bali Madan and Bhagavan boarded the plane for Sydney. The small marble deity of Lord Krishna, previously unpacked from the heavy crate on arrival at Kuala Lumpur, now rested safely in the arms of Bali Madana. You can see some of the early photos of the devotees arriving in Sydney, and they're carrying little bundles, which were actually Radha and Krishna. The same Radha and Krishna that had come to Australia sometime before, waited around for the devotees, and then went back. But they were definitely fixed on finding the devotees, which they did. Srila Prabhupada, Bali Madan and Bhagavan boarded the plane for Sydney. In transit at Singapore airport, Prabhupada bathed and prepared to board the plane for the last leg of his journey to Australia. But Bhagavan yet again found himself in difficulties. Being so concerned with Srila Prabhupada's visa, he had neglected to arrange his own. Whew. Wow, we were disorganized. Immigration authorities in Singapore warned that he would not be allowed to enter Australia when he arrived there, and that they would have to fly him all the way back again. Somehow or other, though, Singapore officials allowed Bhagavan to board the plane, and soon the party was en route to Sydney via Perth. There was just a string of miracles one after the other. Normally they don't let you on the plane, especially in Singapore, so strict. But somehow they said, okay, get on the plane, but you won't be allowed into Australia when you get there. Normally they would have stopped him right there. On the 4-hour flight from Perth to Sydney, Srila Prabhupada occupied the window seat, and lean, bespectacled Bali Madan, with his tightly wrapped deity of Krishna resting on his lap, sat beside him. Prabhupada spoke very little, fingering his japa beads, chanting almost inaudibly. Below stretched the vast, sparsely populated landscape of Australia. If you've ever flown over Australia, you'll know what I mean. You fly for 4 hours and all you see is nothing, just desert. Literally 4 hours. That's a long way. Below stretched the vast, sparsely populated landscape of Australia. Although practically the size of the United States, Australia hosted only a little over 12,700,000 people at that time. It's about double that now, who lived on a very tiny percentage of Australia's total land area. Occasionally, Srila Prabhupada looked out at the broad, unending vista. There is such immense land, he said, yet people are complaining about overpopulation. Enough food can be produced. There are so many vacant places, but they are not being utilized. Bali Madan nodded in agreement. Yes, Srila Prabhupada. There is so much uncultivated land, Srila Prabhupada noted, that the whole world could be fed 10 times over. God has given us the capacity to cultivate and produce food in enough quantity, he said. The scarcity is due to our godlessness. Excuse me. Sunday, 9th of May, 1971. This is a date that stays in the minds of many Australian devotees. For the residents of the Sydney Temple, Srila Prabhupada's arrival was a confused affair. We were very confused little boys and girls. We were just teenagers. An early telegram detailed Srila Prabhupada's proposed visit to Sydney via Malaysia. Only arrival dates and times needed to be confirmed. As it turned out, Srila Prabhupada had arrived in Malaysia a little later than planned, and to make things even more complicated, while in Kuala Lumpur, there had been talk about a couple of devotees in Singapore wanting Prabhupada to come and visit him there. This possible diversion to Singapore would have meant a later arrival date for Srila Prabhupada. So someone had sent a telegram to the Sydney Temple reading, Prabhupada not coming now. I remember when that telegram came and Chiru told us, Prabhupada's not coming now. And we said, oh. But the telegram actually meant Prabhupada not coming now. This is the English language for you. The wording of the telegram was intended to mean that Prabhupada was not coming now, but later. The devotees in Sydney had misconstrued that this meant that Srila Prabhupada was not coming at all. They were understandably disappointed. I remember those roller coaster emotions. It had been too late to arrange any program in Singapore, however. Srila Prabhupada's party had headed off for Sydney, preceded by another telegram announcing that Bali Madan was coming, which meant that he was joining the party as the third member of the group. But we thought that it just meant that Bali Madan was coming instead. So we thought, okay then, he's coming instead. Not the same as Prabhupada coming. So another telegram came, the third telegram, saying arriving and a time, and signed by Bali Madan. So we thought, okay, Bali Madan's coming. At least we got a visitor. Devotees had speculated that this meant Bali Madan was coming instead of Srila Prabhupada. But when Charu rang the airlines early in the morning, which you could do in those days, you could ask who was on the plane. You can't do that anymore. He rang the airlines and they said 2 other passengers were traveling with Bali Madan, Vegavan and A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Charu hastily broke the news to the devotees, whose confusion quickly turned to elation and then panic. The blue Volkswagen Kombi van, was our only vehicle with no windows, except for the front ones. The blue Volkswagen Kombi van screeched down the street to the airport. We were all packed in the back, like little Transcendental sardine devotees. The devotees, none of whom had ever met their spiritual master, waited nervously in the crowded terminal. Can remember it well. And there's photographs too. Occasionally they jumped, straining for a fleeting look at Srila Prabhupada as the customs doors quickly opened and closed. In those days, the customs doors opened like on a stage, opening night. Now they have them on the side, but now the customs doors open, you could see inside. You could see all people opening their bags and showing all their contraband and all the things that go on in customs. It was fully visible each time the doors opened. Now they're a bit more discreet. So there were the doors opening and closing, and as the doors opened and closed, we saw Srila Prabhupada. I recall, as I jumped up, I would catch brief glimpses of Srila Prabhupada as he stood at the immigration desk. He appeared grave, yet radiant and golden in complexion. That was my recollection. Grave, but radiant and golden in complexion. It was like he lit up the whole customs area. Astonishing. With his white attaché case in his hand and a lightweight grey chadar folded over his shoulder, he seemed to be patiently waiting for something. Srila Prabhupada was in fact waiting for Vegavan, who was held up at immigration. Why was Vegavan held up at immigration? Vegavan recalls, when I arrived at immigration, my worst fears were confirmed. They told me there was no way they were going to let me into Australia because I didn't have a visa. We could have told him that. Well, we couldn't, but anyway, he arrived without a visa. What to do? Vegavan protested. I protested, so they sent me to a special room to speak to the head of the department. I pleaded with the man that I was married to an Australian girl, so he asked me for my marriage certificate. I told him that I didn't have one, but that recently I was married in India at a special ceremony presided over by my spiritual master. Then I remembered that I had a photograph of my marriage at the Cross Maidan. So I showed the immigration man those photographs. The man had just seen Srila Prabhupada as he had just come through immigration with his valid visa, and he seemed impressed with him. Even though I had no visa, the man stamped my passport, indefinite stay, which was in itself quite unusual, in fact unheard of. When I went back to the immigration barrier, the man behind the desk was incredulous. He couldn't believe it, but I could understand that this was Prabhupada's potency. Cheryl recalls, Cheryl became Rasarani Devidasi. Cheryl. Churu had warned the ladies not to scream when Srila Prabhupada came through customs. But of course, when he suddenly appeared, we all jumped up and down and screamed. I can still remember, high-pitched. When we bowed down, most of us prostrate. Some devotees simply lay down on the airport arrival lounge and didn't get up. You can see a picture of Prabhupada looking down in one photograph, and he's looking down on all the ladies who have decided to become like statues and just lie there on the floor until further notice. So they had to be reminded that when you pay your obeisances, there is a stage where you eventually have to stand up again and get back to life as normal. But they didn't know what to do. They only knew half the story. You lay down on the floor. But they didn't know the second part, which is you stand up again. So there they were, bowing down, prostrate. Some devotees simply laid on the airport arrival lounge floor and didn't get up. And Srila Prabhupada's way was obstructed. We had to tap them on the shoulder and ask them to move. We were so thrilled to see Srila Prabhupada. Charu recalls, I remember I was so enthusiastic about seeing my spiritual master for the first time. When he came through the customs gates, I offered my obeisances so vigorously that I banged my head on the floor. I was pretty much half conscious for the rest of the day. I think I even gave myself a mild concussion. I was only semi-conscious, and I didn't know whether that was due to the blow on my head or the delirium of having Srila Prabhupada with us. Unquote. A jubilant kirtan started up as Prabhupada, now garlanded with flowers and looking healthy from his 8 months in India, proceeded to the press lounge. Charu had hurriedly arranged for a conference only hours before, and a few reporters and photographers now quickly gathered and followed the party to the lounge. A reporter inquired from Srila Prabhupada about his background and why he was now coming to Australia. Prabhupada patiently explained that there were 4 orders of life: brahmachari, celibate life; grihastha, family life; vanaprastha, retired life; and finally sannyasa, renounced life. Prabhupada pointed out to the reporters that this was his final stage of life, and that his business now was to spread Krishna consciousness throughout the Western world on the order of his spiritual master. Krishna consciousness, he said, was a great spiritual movement, and the leaders of Australia should come to hear his message. After a few more questions, the conference was over. Accompanied by more melodious chanting, Srila Prabhupada proceeded down the long corridor to the exit. He appeared to the assembled devotees just like they had seen him in the Back to Godhead magazine, only even more regal, aristocratic, and effulgent. He walked looking straight ahead, quickly followed by devotees, many of whom were still stunned by the shock of seeing their spiritual master for the first time. Some cried, holding their hands together reverently in pranams. Bali Madan, with one arm carefully embracing the tightly wrapped deity of Krishna, stood close to Prabhupada's side. Straight behind, Vegavan carried the deity of Radharani. Prabhupada emerged from the automatic glass doors into the bright sunlight. Bamboo cane in his right hand, white travelling case in the left, Prabhupada walked purposefully to the waiting vehicle. Like Prabhupada's original temple in New York, the Sydney temple at 118 Oxford Street, Paddington, was also a one-roomed shopfront. That's the sort of temple we always went for in those days. We thought temple meant shopfront. It was a one-roomed shopfront on a heavily trafficked business thoroughfare. Paddington, a quaint old suburb which took its name from the well-known London borough, lay 3 kilometres southeast of central downtown Sydney. It featured many Victorian-style colonial buildings with their prominent decorative iron lace balconies. Directly across the divided highway from the temple stood the imposing brown sandstone facade of the Victorian Army Barracks, purported to be the longest building in Australia. The temple accompanied one half of a double-fronted terrace house, and was nestled between a hairdressing salon and a fabric shop. It was situated in a mainly non-residential strip of Oxford Street, consisting of coffee shops, a few offices, restaurants, pubs, and milk bars, as they were known. On the large display window of the temple, Christine had painted an impressive, almost life-sized mural of Radha and Krishna inside the lotus flower whirl of the spiritual sky. There are photographs. Above the mural was painted in Christine's recognizable free-flowing hand, Sri Sri Radha Krishna Temple. Above the window, stretched across the white iron lacework, was another hand-painted sign on a thick cloth. Welcome, Srila Prabhupada. While most of the devotees had rushed off to the airport, Upananda, that was the first young brahmachari to join the temple, he had stayed back to cook and clean, and he was assisted by Deepak, an enthusiastic young American brahmachari recently sent from Los Angeles to assist the devotees in deity worship. He had been trained by Shilavati Devidasi, who was the original pujari in America. One batch of devotees had made it back in time to start an impromptu kirtan on the street. I was there. The blue combi van, adorned with a painting of Krishna in his threefold bending form, pulled up at the curbside. The kirtan intensified. Upananda, who had been frantically trying to simultaneously clean the temple and cook Srila Prabhupada's lunch, rushed out and opened the door for Prabhupada. He quickly stepped back and bowed down on the pavement. You all know what a pavement is, don't you? From our American readers today or watchers, that's the sidewalk. As Charu quickly jumped out of the driver's seat and ran around to help Prabhupada down from the elevated passenger seat at the front, it was a big drop. We practically had to carry Prabhupada down. It was like a 2-foot drop. The side door of the van slid open, spilling devotees out onto the street. I remember spilling out onto the street. Funny how you remember little things. Prabhupada glanced down at Upananda, patting him affectionately on his head, smiling. He walked towards the temple door. Prabhupada slipped off his white Indian rubber sandals and tightly pushed the temple door. It was locked. Jeffrey Gordon, my father, recalls. My father passed away last week. Jeffrey Gordon. Our son, Philip, had invited his mother and I won't say it with a Yorkshire accent. My father had a very rich Yorkshire accent, which he never lost. Our son had invited his mother and I to be at the temple that morning. To see Prabhupada for the first time. It was all very strange and foreign to us, especially the chanting. And while they all greeted Prabhupada outside, we preferred to stay in the temple. They were actually embarrassed to be seen with the Hare Krishnas. It wasn't the thing to do in those days, especially chanting on the street. I mean, they came to the temple. It was amazing. They just came. They're very submissive. I quickly opened the door. Oh, this is Jeffrey speaking. I quickly opened the door because Prabhupada went to the door and he found that it was locked. We were all on the floor, bowing down. Prabhupada was the only one standing. Went to the door, pushed the door. Well, I can't get in. So my father pulled the little cloth curtain and he saw Prabhupada was at the door. So what do? As a gentleman, you open the door. So he opened the door for Prabhupada. That was his first devotional service for Srila Prabhupada. And there was Prabhupada trying to get in. I quickly opened the door, and as Prabhupada entered, he gave me a little nod of appreciation. If you can somehow get a nod of appreciation from Krishna's pure devotee, then your life is successful. So we'll continue this epic story of Srila Prabhupada in Australia the great transcendental adventure next time, and we'll continue with this chapter, In the Hands of the Malechas. Who were the Malechas? Well, they were us. And Srila Prabhupada is going to leave Radha and Krishna in our unqualified hands. So stay tuned for the next exciting episode, which will be episode 5 of the Great Transcendental Adventure. Hare Krishna. Thank you very much.